Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. We've had quite a jam-packed day. So thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to welcome our three panelists also. And the title of this panel is Working with Different Modes. I'd like to remind our panelists that you have been given co-host privileges, so you'll be able to share your screen. And please make sure when you leave the room, you just leave the room and don't close the room, because otherwise it'll close for everybody all over. So we'll start right away, and I'll give each panelist a 1-minute heads up just before you end, so that you'll kind of know where you are time-wise. Our first panelist is Maria Park Bobroff. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who will be speaking about specs grading and task-based assessments in fourth semester French. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining us or joining me today. I'm going to be talking about specs grading and task-based assessments in fourth semester French. And before I get going, I want to thank a colleague of mine, Laura Florent, who is actually in a different session right now. She and I have been working together on alternative grading and presented together at ACTFL this past year. And so some of these slides I have borrowed from my part of that presentation. I'd like to thank my colleagues at my previous institution, Guilford College, because back in summer of 2020, after the pandemic hit, they invited Linda Nilsson to speak to us. And as you can see here with her book, she was the one, or her book rather, is what got me interested in alternative grading. And I'd also like to thank my current colleagues at Boston University who have been so willingly open to letting me explore this and have been so willing to try it along with me. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so what is specification grading? So the four basic principles behind it are, it's a type of ungrading and it uses a binary scale. Some people use the terms pass, fail. I don't like those terms because that carries a lot of weight with our students. So I use met and not yet met. Each assignment that I give students has some kind of criteria to it, or the specs. And as long as they hit those specs, they earn credit for that assignment. Students can submit some or all assignments if they do not initially meet the specs. And then the final course grade that is submitted to the registrar is based on a bundle of assignments that are preset and determined. So those are the main characteristics of specs grading. So why I use it? I like the simplicity. I imagine many of you have spent a lot of time fretting over grades and whether something's an A- or a B+, or is this a point, or is this 2 points? This is just, is it yes or is it no? After that, I get to focus on giving my students constructive, equitable, and forward-looking feedback. With this system, my students can take risks with their language without fear of negative consequences for making a mistake. So they are never penalized for errors, but rather they work towards meeting the criteria of the assignment. I have seen my students shift from a grade-oriented mindset to a growth-oriented mindset. Not all of them, and not all of them at the same rate, but it is present. And I've also noticed their skills and their confidence especially improved. So I want to talk a little bit about how I converted a fourth semester course, which is a fourth semester is a requirement at Boston University. So I started with a pre-existing course and a pre-existing syllabus. And if anyone has not yet done this and is thinking about it, I think that's a huge benefit to already have something and not be working from scratch. For major assessments where there's a right or a plausible answer, I set my specs at 80%. So if it's, say, an exam situation, if the student earns 80% on that assignment, they have met the specs. If it's assessment with open-ended answers, I choose 3 or 4 criteria and I spell them out to those students. Any errors that they might make that are not related to those criteria do not count against them. So for example, if there were a writing passage they had to do, I might say the specs are write at least 30 words per question, incorporate 5 of the structures listed below, and those would be structures we would have just studied in that unit, and use them accurately and logically. So as long as they do those things, they've earned credit. Which is not to say will give them feedback and comments on other things, but it doesn't count against them. For formative assessments, I've created a series of real-world activities that I use in lieu of traditional workbook activities. Though I do still have the workbook activities from the publisher available to the students, they remain optional. The students can use them for extra practice. I do not evaluate them. And then I also instituted a system of virtual tokens. So virtual tokens, what are they and how do I use them? So in an ideal world, and especially with specs, I would love to let my students resubmit all their work until they met the specs. But the reality is, at least for now, I haven't figured out a way how I can handle that. With the number of students I have, and the number of assignments, and the number of classes, I just can't be present for them in the classroom with an unlimited number of resubmissions coming in. So in order to make sure I can give them timely and quality feedback, I've used this token system wherein at the start of the semester, I give every student 3 virtual tokens. They can use a token to submit an assignment up to 1 week late. They can submit a token to resubmit an assignment if they do not meet the specs the first time around. And actually, if they then don't meet it the second time, I don't require a second token. They can just keep submitting until they meet the specs. And then at the end of the semester, whatever they can exchange their remaining tokens as a way to boost their final grade. So as an example of, this is the grading rubric, or rather grading scale, that I use in this course. And this is from this semester that's going on right now. And I've created 2 columns, a starting point of a B+ and a starting point of a C+. And the students have to do everything in that column to start at a B+. So attendance is essential. They have to do self-evaluations of their participation. This 3rd line dash, these are the real world activities I've created. And then cultural activities, etc. And you'll see that first bullet point stresses to them that there is no percentages that they're used to, for example, that one thing is weighted more than the other, and that they must do everything in the column, and if they miss something, it defaults to the lower column. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an example of some of the real world tasks that I've created in the effort of inspiring the students to use their language for something they might actually need to do at some point. So here's something I created about, and it is in French, but I'll give you a brief overview. So you can see here, I always give the instructions and the specs in English and tell them what they're doing. They're going to be responding to some readings. I expect it to take 60 minutes. They have unlimited time. And then the specs are, they need to work independently without any help from outside, or except for me. If they want to come to me, they can. They can use their textbook or word reference, and they have to answer 80% of the questions correctly. And that's it. If they do that, they've met the specs. So then I give them the context, and the context in this case is, imagine you've just arrived in Paris, you've got to get yourself from the airport to the city, which a lot of them maybe over spring break, or some of them maybe are going to be doing. And then I've taken screenshots from the websites of the airport. And then on the right, you can see like that's a screenshot of tourist passes for getting around. And so I take real live shots, and then I ask them questions. And questions can be like, okay, if you're going, you want to get to this part in the city, which train do you take? Or if you want to do this number of museums, which pass do you want to take? Another example would be a listening activity I created, and this is about the cartoonist Riyad Sattouf. You can see again, I give the parameters and the specs in English at the beginning, and then I switch to the target language of the context and tell them that they're about to read up on Riyad Sattouf, who is a well-known cartoonist. And then as they scroll down through this is all embedded on our Blackboard page. I have some images, and I have a video of him going through his exhibit that was in the Centre Pompidou. And then there are a number of questions asking them that they'd have to answer, showing that they have understood the video. And then lastly, a third one, for writing, I created this one. This would be an assignment that they would actually complete in class. And I've given them a situation where, okay, imagine you are a university student, which you are, and you're looking for an internship, and you have to respond to these questions on your form that you're applying for these internships. And they're very open-ended. So tell me about your university education. Why are you a good candidate for this job? What do you want to get out of this? What are your long-term objectives? So they're very open-ended in terms of the content that the student can use. I always tell them that they never have to tell me the truth, quote unquote. They can just give me something plausible. They never have to reveal personal information that they don't want to. And then as you can see in the specs here, it'll say that fourth bullet point, incorporate at least 8 of the following structures. So lower on that page, if this were actually a piece of paper, you could see these are the structures we would have just studied in the class. And I have 10 here, and they have to incorporate 8 of them correctly to earn credit for the assignment. Of course, they can always, if they don't, they can always submit a token and redo it. So the types of feedback I give them, I like to give them supportive comments like great use of the imparfait, or constructive corrections. I think you need to review the futur. I also will spend time giving them suggestions for supplementary work they could do. Why don't you think about doing this? It'll help improve X skill. Then the types of comments I've gotten back from students. So you can see in that first one, it was kind of a textbook answer, like I was really unsure, but then I learned how great this was, and I was much less stressed about making mistakes and taking risks because I wasn't concerned about ABC and ABC grade. And then another student who said, the biggest strength of this course would be the grading system. It allows students to relax and to focus on the thoughts that they're trying to present. And then some final thoughts. So I do have my students write self-reflections on their performance, but I do not have them grade themselves. And that is for a question on a reason of equity, because I have found over the years that some students are very confident in giving themselves A's, and some students are very timid about giving themselves strong grades, and those do not necessarily reflect their true abilities. So I give them the opportunity to give me comments of how they are doing, and I give them comments back, but I don't take a grade as such on that. Some instructors and some of the material out there talking about specs will argue that specs grading is less time consuming. That has not been my experience. I spend just as much time grading, but I will say my grading is not stressful anymore. I no longer dread it. I no longer go into it thinking, how am I gonna, my comments need to justify this point that I've removed or this, instead it's a simple, did you do the 3 things or no? And now let me give you constructive feedback. And then lastly, going forward, I would like to find a way to uncouple the tokens from the final grade. I haven't figured out a way to do that. But if I go back to that chart that I had given you, let me scroll back up here.
1 minute.
Thank you. The way that they would boost from a B+ to an A- and an A- to an A would be exchanging tokens that they have not used. So that's how that, and I'd like to find a way to uncouple that. And that is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you. Our next panelist is Morgane Haesen. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
And very good. And she'll be speaking to us about le Pacte Autobiographique et le Pacte Scolaire, lessons from contract grading in a small French literature course. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. All right, I'll just go ahead and share my screen. All right. Okay. All right, so hello and thank you all for coming virtually. It's been a pleasure listening to everyone today and getting ideas. It's all very exciting. So my name is Morgane Haesen, and I'm an assistant professor of French and Francophone studies at High Point University in North Carolina. And today I'm going to relate the process of implementing ungrading in a small French literature class. So I will first explain the model which I followed, namely the contract-based model, which I just learned that overlaps a little bit with specs grading. So I followed the contract model outlined by Christina Katapadis and Kathy Ann Davidson in their chapter titled Contract Grading and Peer Review, in a Susan Bloom edited 2020 book titled Ungrading: Why Rating Students Undermines Learning. I will then offer details on how I had to modify the model to adhere to university and departmental regulations, as well as my overall learning objectives. So my presentation will be somewhat technical, as I will mostly focus on the creation of the contract itself and not other aspects of the course, like the rubrics we use or the self-reflections we did. Finally, I will share the 3 lessons I learned throughout the semester and the subsequent changes I made, the most important one being linked to a foundational aspect of the ways in which students are evaluated with this model, and that was due to my very small class size. In turn, my experience in this paper offers insight. This paper offers insight on Katapadis and Davidson's comment that, quote, size may matter. We don't personally know whether it does, but it may. Now, their remark refers to large class sizes, but I'll provide some consideration for small class sizes, which is characteristic of upper level world language courses at smaller universities. So I came across Ungrading just last spring in a service learning workshop. And so this is very much a new field of research and practice for me. But right away, I knew I wanted to implement it. So I researched it over summer, and this past fall, I had the opportunity to implement it. I was assigned an upper level literature course. It was a chronological overview of French literary movements in the 20th and 21st centuries. And I adapted the course to focus on life writings, which is my research specialization or another one. And so students explored concepts such as Philippe Legendre Pacte Autobiographique, and they read excerpts from diaries and autofiction by authors such as Colette, Atiyeh, and Fabienne Queneau. Because this was a relatively small class, less than 10 students, I thought it was an ideal class to test run an ungrading model. And while issues were bound to arise in this first implementation, it'd be much easier to handle with 8 or 9 students than with 20 or 30, of course. So in my research, I was immediately drawn to the contract-based model. It's been studied by many scholars. We've heard it throughout the day today, but and it's sometimes called labor-based ungrading, but I followed the model by Kathy Davidson in the aforementioned book. So first, this model consists of having students individually decide on their overall course grade at the beginning of the semester in a contract between them and myself, based on what they have going on in their lives, or even based on their interest in the course itself. They'll aim for an A, B, C, or D grade. Second, this contract does not award numerical grades. Instead, Davidson uses a satisfactory or unsatisfactory system for the evaluation of assessment. And when I show you my modified contract in just a little bit, I use the terminology check or unchecked, meaning if a student turned in satisfactory work, he or she received a check mark for that assignment. Also, Davidson explains that the evaluation process for most of the assignments is done via peer reviews, or what she calls the badging method. This allows for in-depth individualized feedback and metacognitive reflections about others and one's own work, as well as develop students' own evaluation skills. Finally, and maybe most importantly, I was drawn to this model because I knew I could actually do it at a high point. Indeed, as Davidson points out, some universities will not allow ungrading. And even if they do, there are a lot of university, college, and department level regulations and policies to include. So I knew the contract model was already in place in our honors program, as well as service learning courses. And so I only had to worry about including 3 policies. First, the grade benchmarks highlighted in our undergraduate bulletin. So for example, an A+ grade represents anything above a 98. A is between a 94 and a 98%, etc. So I had to figure out how to allow for these options in the contract. The second policy was a departmental attendance policy, which stated that students may miss up to 2 classes without penalty. And finally, our French minors and majors need to attend a weekly conversation hour. And so I needed this to represent roughly 5% of their overall grade. So after lots of tweaking and way too much math, this is what the contract ended up looking for my course. Based on my learning objectives, I wanted to place emphasis on class discussions and the final project, which was a formal literary analysis, commentaire composé. So I transformed these requirements by having each attendance and meaningful participation be 1 check mark, and each step of the final paper also be worth a check mark. So the abstract, outline, rough draft, and final draft. So in total, I had 41 of these check marks, and they needed to represent 60% of all check marks possible in the class, which, according to university grade benchmarks, would represent 60% or a D, a passing grade. So coming to class, having read the materials, contributing to class discussions, and writing the final paper would be the basic passing requirements for my course. I then identified additional assignments I wanted for the course, namely making vocabulary lists, writing summaries and short reaction papers, and presenting on various authors and literary movements. And I assigned 27 possible of these additional assignments throughout the semester. And I chose that number 27 because in addition to the already 41 check marks needed to pass the class, 27 check marks will represent the next 30% of their overall grade. So if a student wanted a C, they wanted to contract for a C, they would need to do those 41 mandatory check marks plus 7 of these additional assignments. So 41 check marks plus 7 equals 48, and that would represent roughly 70% of all possible check marks, so a C grade. If a student wanted a B, they needed to do 14 of these additional assignments to reach an 80%. And if a student wanted an A, they had to complete 21 of these assignments to reach 90%. And to make sure students completed a variety of these 4 assignments, they had a minimum of each sort to do. And finally, in the spirit of ungrading, I offered built-in flexibility, or what I thought was flexibility. So for example, a student aiming for an A needed a minimum of 6 reaction papers. So I assigned 8 possible dates for them to turn in those reaction papers. Of course, I prefer to have students write a reaction paper when they're moved or intrigued by a particular text instead of just mandating a date. And this also allowed them flexibility on deciding when to do the assignments. All right, so the last 10% of their overall grade consisted of building in the contract, the French conversation hour, as well as possible unsatisfactory work turned in. So 5% represented the attendance at our French conversation hour, which transformed whatever grade they were aiming for as a plus. So a C plus, a B plus, or an A plus. Moreover, if they turned in several unsatisfactory work, this would bring their grade down to a C minus, B minus, or A minus. So roughly the last 5% of their overall grade. With this system, I was adhering to university grade benchmarks of pluses and minuses. So here's what the contract looked like. In this first column, these are, so the student in this case was aiming for a B plus. And this meant that they needed to have all the check marks in this first column, so attendance and participation. Per the departmental attendance policy, they could miss 2 of these check marks or 2 classes. Moreover, they needed 14 additional assignments with a minimum of 4 summaries, reaction papers, and presentations each. And they could choose when to do the assignments. So the boxes here represent the check marks or when I assigned them. And finally, they had to attend 5 conversation hours, and so I kept track of that in these little check marks below. And I have the link to this Word document later on if you're interested. So I was super happy having figured out the logistics of this contract, but of course I ran into some few issues, but with my wonderful students, we worked it all out together. So here is what I learned. First, that students still need to be first and foremost the focus of the class. Regardless of whatever ideas I had about ungrading and the minute details I had figured out. Concretely, what did this mean? I had to change the peer review system, the way in which almost all assignments were evaluated with the contract model. So indeed, during the first week of classes, the first day actually, I was approached by a number of students who did not want their work to be mostly graded by their peers. The reasons range from being afraid of being unfairly evaluated since they felt that their language work proficiency were inferior to that of their peers. Another reason was that they just cited discomfort in being peer evaluated when the process would not be anonymous. And apparently they had that experience in other classes. Now, these concerns really arose because of the small class size. Students felt quite vulnerable. And as Bell Hooks has taught us, quote, to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. While the first concern could have been avoided by meaningfully adhering to rubrics, I did not want any student to feel uncomfortable in my class, of course. So for this reason, I got rid of peer evaluations altogether, and I evaluated the work myself based on the rubrics we had come up with. So this had 3 major consequences. Because feedback is pivotal to the ungrading model, specifically this one, I built in one-on-one meetings with all my students every 2 to 3 weeks to talk about their assignments. And this really allowed for in-depth feedback, especially with their final papers. Secondly, this also allowed me to meet them where they were in their language skills. And finally, because students did not spend time inside or outside of class peer reviewing work, we had a lot more time for discussions and readings, and we had an amazing dynamic going by the end of the course. Even though peer reviewing is supposed to be an active community, our course itself had to become our little community. All right, my second lesson was to rid myself of the limits we have probably internalized from the grading system. So I explained earlier that I had set 8 possible dates to turn in 6 reaction papers, thinking I had built-in flexibility. However, students approached me to ask if they could turn in reaction papers when I had not scheduled one for that day. And this happened over and over again. And so by the 4th week, I gave students the option to turn in those assignments whenever they had the time, whenever they were intrigued by a particular text, etc. So this is the final iteration of that contract after the first 2 changes, and they're in yellow. So I had the meetings, the réunion here, as well as possible check marks or possible assignments for every reading, every class period we did. All right, and I see I'm running out of time. So on this little version, I'd just like to point out that Every weekend, I would update this contract for each student, and I would actually have a link to their specific contract on our LMS. And the link only worked for them, of course, for that student. And so this is actually how we kept track of their progress. All right, and this brings me to my last lesson, that no matter how much we want to avoid grades and numbers, they will still be present, unfortunately. And even in this presentation itself, right, which was overall technical. As Jesse Strommel has warned, quote, contracts do run the risk of centering grades even more than traditional grading, but at their best, the negotiation around the contract becomes a way for students to collectively worry about the edges of the grading system. And indeed, at the end of the semester, I had conversations with students who worried about their tallies and their grade. Something I had not anticipated, for example, was that students could reach all of their minimums except for one assignment category. So this student, for example, had contracted for an A+. They had completed all their requirements except for their reaction papers. They needed 6, but they only had done 4. And so after some negotiation and based on some other factors, we ended up on a B+ as their final grade. And that conversation and negotiation did take some time away from learning and feedback. It was overall a rare instance during which the grade became the topic of discussion.
30 seconds.
Thank you. So overall, while there were issues in this first iteration of the contract model, all students who answered the informal survey found ungrading useful, especially when it came to meaningful feedback. They also stated that it was a lot less stressful. So for me, that was a slam dunk. I was very happy with that feedback. I'll continue to experiment with it and to implement it. I'll conclude this talk by sharing the contract with you all. Here's a QR code and a link. There are still some issues I need to reflect upon, and I'll most likely change in the future. Some of what I implemented may not work for you as well with your institutional circumstances, or your learning objectives, or your ungrading priorities. And so on that note, I'll end on a quote by Davidson. Experiment with the model below as a template to start with, and then take some time to make it your own. That is, after all, what some of what we mean by peer-to-peer learning, acknowledging that none of us is ever entirely independent in our thinking, however original we may think ourselves to be. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Morgane. Thank you. Our last panelist is Maite Correa, and her talk from Colorado State University at Fort Collins. And her talk is entitled Implementing Effort-Based Agreements in a Graduate Spanish Syntax Course. You can take it away, Maite. Maite, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. You're probably on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much all for coming. I'm very glad that the two people who presented before me did, because I can build up on some of the things that Morgane and Mariah said. I'm gonna start just by kind of like summarizing a little bit what are the principles of socially just or equity-focused radical pedagogical trends in the last 50 years, starting with Freire and continuing all the way to our colleague Claudia, who just
Maite,
yes.
Maite, I'm sorry for interrupting you. We do see the screen, but it looks like it's your desktop with a bunch of files and all that.
Sorry. Let me see if, what about now?
There, now we can, yes.
Are you
go ahead.
seeing my notes or the presentation itself?
Both of them.
Okay, then it should be, I don't know what happened here. It's just gonna show you the notes. Let's see. You seen that you have prepared everything and then you don't, right?
Technology, it's always that.
Right? Let me share the other screen instead. New share. I'm gonna share screen number 3. What about now?
No, it's your desktop. There's a
Can you
beautiful
see now?
tree.
Still the tree?
Yeah, it's a tree.
I just have 3 desktops. That's my problem.
Well, maybe
Maite,
where you even had with the notes would be fine because it was with 2.
in PowerPoint, under the setup show options, you should be able to switch it to show just the presentation in a single window.
What can you see now? Can you see my screen?
And no, it's the tree again.
The tree,
Hmm.
and I'll share this other screen. What about now?
The same tree.
You can stop sharing and share just your screen, not the desktop. Just
Okay.
stop sharing and then reshare your screen. Click Zoom one.
Screen 1. What about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you for whoever was giving the guidance.
Okay. So my presentation is based on these trends that are based on trust, transparency, and collaboration, and they redefine the roles of students and teachers for an equitable, adaptable, and inclusive learning environment with broad and flexible goals. And so these departures from standardized one-fits-all approaches, and these are the frameworks that I'm working with, starting, as I said, with Freire in the 70s, all the way to the critical sociocultural linguistic literacy CRISOL from Claudia Ogin Mendoza, who presented this morning. So the problem with conventional grading economies is that they are very appealing because they are kind of like easy. However, there's a lot of problems that come with those conventional grading economies. The first one is that grades do not necessarily reflect quality of learning. The second one is that there's inconsistency and subjectivity, not only for inter-rater reliability issues, but also intra-rater reliability issues. As Maria said a couple talks ago, the teacher focus is usually on justifying a grade instead of useful feedback, and that is a problem. So we'll talk about how ungrading is a liberatory practice. And we have this fixation on grades because grades are a gateway for students to either go to the next level, to get a job, or to have their grades on their transcript. And that brings a lot of adverse outcomes, such as decreased performance, superficial thinking, anxiety, and avoidance of challenging tasks. And that obviously has effects on mental health. So all in all these traditional grading practices usually disadvantage students from lower social classes or from different environments than the typical student. So I have 2 quotes here. One is from Kahn from 2013. He said, "I think it's possible to assess for learning, but grading for learning is rather like bombing for peace. Rating and ranking students is inherently counterproductive." And I think we've talked about that enough today. And the other quote I have is from Stommel, who says, "We don't prepare students for a world of potential oppression by oppressing them." So obviously, when I'm thinking about ungrading, I'm thinking about heritage language learners, but I do not teach heritage language learners right now, so I've tried to adapt it to other populations of students. So liberatory for whom? We talk about how liberatory ungrading could be for students because of anxiety and because they can actually go ahead and innovate and take risks and see mistakes as productive. But it's also liberatory for teachers, as Maria said 30 minutes ago, because when we're grading now, we're grading to give constructive feedback and not necessarily to justify why they didn't get a 100, which is usually it's the part of grading that we don't like. It's the negativity, like why you are not perfect, right? So I think that is both liberatory for students and teachers in that sense. So my take on this is the engagement-based agreements, which is my version of Inuit's labor-based contract, which is very similar to what the person before me was presenting. I think her name was Marion or something like that. So labor is now engagement. I prefer the word engagement even than effort. Originally, I thought about effort-based agreements, but I think it's more engagement with the material. And instead of contracts, I prefer agreements because they are not really signing anything. It's more like an agreement that we have together. And I think that by calling them engagement-based agreements, it's just a little bit, I like those words a little bit better. I think they're better for students not to be reactive to something that says labor in contract, thinking about the small print or something like that. So my model is agreed upon by everyone. So we agree at the beginning of the semester, how many freebies do they get? Like how many minor assignments can they miss? How many major assignments they can submit late? How many assignments are we gonna have? And all that is agreed upon by everyone, and that's why I like to call it agreement. It's also based on quantity of that engagement and not on quality. So my part of the deal is that if you follow the instructions, you have the number of words, the number of sources, you have an interesting title formatting. I usually ask for double space so I can give them feedback. And if you submit it on time, you get full points. It doesn't matter quality-wise how you do it, and that was a concern, but it actually worked. So the initial goal for my agreements is a B, and I chose B following Inoue because a B is for some students a very desired grade, and for some other students is a stepping stone to an A. So up to week 13, they are only working for a B, and from week 14 to week 16, they can do additional work for a B plus, an A minus, or an A, and that additional work will be something for their classmates or their future classmates. Like, for example, a letter about how they feel about ungrading, or how to do well in the course, or maybe going through our repository of articles and cleaning it, something that will be for the benefit of the whole class. As I said before, the freebies, students can miss a number of assignments without any questions or penalty. If you're sick, you come to class and you didn't do a class activity. If you're sick and didn't do a minor assignment or something, it's you have the possibility to miss some of them without any questions or penalty. But it's really important, the time logs and reflective journals, because I want to know how much time they're spending on each assignment. And that also helps them write the reflective journals about what is their motivation. Do you have internal motivation or intrinsic motivation for this assignment, or your only motivation was external because you just needed to do it? Where were you? Were you in your dorm? I don't think grad students are in their dorm, but were you in your house with your roommates? Were you in a coffee shop? Were you in your office? Did that help you concentrate or not? So I'm also asking in those reflective journals for them to engage in metacognitive strategies and self-reflection. So why did I choose a graduate Spanish syntax course? First, because that's what I was teaching. I was also teaching a leadership course for honor students, but it was pass-fail. So I also did ungrading, but it's not very fun to talk about ungrading, which is pass-fail. So I thought that my graduate Spanish syntax course was a very good course because it had a very good mixture of heritage, native, non-native students. It had a very, very level of syntax knowledge. Some students had never taken a linguistics course, and some other students already had a master's degree. So that starting point was very, very unequal. And I want them all to show that they could learn from where they started to the next step, whatever that step would be. So the advantages of these agreements is that they're measurable and easy, I would say, in quotes, to understand. So what I did for students to know where they were was a calculator that I created on Google Sheets with formulas that you cannot really see here, but students can fill out that yellow portion and say how many homeworks are late, how many are missing, how many major assignments are late or missing. And I divided it only in 3 class activities and homeworks, major assignments and minor assignments, so they can just put the numbers there. And in that green cell, they would see where they are. So this is just an example of somebody who has missed a lot of assignments. So instead of an 85, that the agreement is trying to reach, the student would have ended up with an 81 with the possibility of raising it to a 91. So this calculator was essential for students to be on the same page, because as I will discuss later, learning management systems, the grade books that are there, they're a little bit difficult to work with when it comes to these ungrading systems. These agreements are tailored to meet diverse needs and starting points. They're socially just, equitable, and inclusive. Everybody in my class learned, and everybody started at a different place, and everybody ended up in a different place as well, but that's fine. The agreements encourage risk-taking and productive failure without punishment. I think that students, at some point, they got comfortable to come to me with hypotheses, with different ideas that we were very welcome to explore together. They also place agency at the core by promoting those metacognitive and non-cognitive strategies. I wanted to tell me, when do you learn better? Why is this difficult for you? How could you have done this better? Maybe you should have done this assignment in a different place or a different time in the day. Were you tired? Were you hungry, etc.? So I think that is really something that I didn't do before when I was just grading traditionally. These agreements also promote a growth mindset, and they cultivate a culture of continuous learning, as evidence from my students who are still coming to my office with some hypothesis as if we were still in syntax class. So I love that part. And it's based on cooperative learning and not competition, that we talked about ranking students before. And in this case, I asked students to do homework together and then just to write it individually. But they can definitely talk to each other. They can give each other feedback, and they are all learning, not only from the teacher, but they're learning from each other, which was great in this syntax class, because we had students from very different dialects, and they were all contributing with their own data that they had heard their parents say, etc. So I think that that was a very positive aspect of the agreements. So things that worked, anxiety levels about missing class. I had students who missed class. They were anxious about not doing something right or not having the time to do an assignment. And those anxiety levels went down. The beginning, they were a little high because they were, oh, what's this ungrading thing? But later on, I think all of them, they came and said, actually, I feel okay. I don't feel that anxiety of what grade I'm going to be getting from this assignment. We still did exams, but I counted exams as you did it, you didn't do, but it was a way for me to give them feedback and for them to see if they had been in a class that had been graded, how they would have done. So my anecdotal evidence from those exams that they did is that they were very similar to other exams I had given in the past when I was giving grades. So that was also very positive.
One minute.
As I said, different levels at the beginning, but everybody learned. Not everyone went for the A. Some students decided just to have a B. The motivation was more about learning for their own classes and their own language than for them. And they were very honest about doing things last minute or completing shorter assignments, and it was fine because they were allowed to. And my feedback, as I said, was based on being constructive. Fear of syntax became respect for syntax, and respect for syntax became playing with syntax. And they all self-reflected on whether they met the objectives that were on the syllabus or not. So we have already talked about academic integrity, so I'm not going to get into that, but I would recommend that everybody has a flexible AI policy so students can use it if they need. Different levels of effort. You can talk to the students if you feel that they are not doing enough, and that's why the time log completion is important. Revision of assignments following feedback should be counted as additional assignments so they can redo and get another assignment done. And I would also add one-on-one conferencing as an activity, because I feel that feedback is much easier to give in person that in written form. And careful pre-planning is needed. You need to know how many assignments you're going to have. You need to know how many it would be okay for them to miss. If you think you're going to have 80 assignments, you're going to give more freebies than if you're going to have 40 assignments. So that planning is important. And as I said before, the grade books and language management systems are very challenging. So that's why I did the calculator. So in conclusion, I'm just saying that it's very hard work, but it pays off. It was very fun to grade, as my colleagues have said before. Students were initially suspicious, but then they see that actually it works. And my questions are the same as many of my colleagues. This might be ideal for heritage language learners, but how would it work for students in 1st through 5th semester? And I think we just got a couple examples of how that could be done. So I'm currently implementing EBAs in different courses. I think they work differently. So you have to really think about what kind of grade I'm going to do for which class, what are the objectives, and go from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maite. Okay, everyone, we do have 10 minutes left for any, Maite, if you could stop sharing your screen, that would be great.
I'm trying.
Oh, you're trying.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
I didn't know. All right, perfect. Thank you very much to all three speakers. We do have 10 minutes left, and so I don't see actual questions in the chat, but I'd very much like, and I know our panelists would like to hear any questions you may have. I may just start it off, since I don't see questions on the chat. I'll just take my prerogative of having the microphone. And Maite, the course you taught was a graduate student course. And of course, we know that graduate students have chosen their graduate studies, and they're normally hyper-motivated students in any case. How do you think that that would work, especially since you had your grade? And so, we've come to understand that ungrading still arrives at a grade. It concludes with a grade at the end. So how the grades of the graduate students that were based primarily on completion of work. So I noticed that you had late, incomplete, or missing for them to receive full credit, and there was no qualitative assessment of what they did and feedback. Do you feel that qualitatively they did the same effort and got in as much as if it were done differently? And do you think it would work, in your view, the way you did it for lower level courses?
That's the golden question. In last year, I had a fresh people seminar, but they were honor students, so they already come with different ideas, and it was pass fail. And then I had a grad course, so they were very, very different. Right now, I'm teaching a 300 level course that is mostly discussion. So I think it depends on what the objectives of the course are. In syntax, for example, it's a grad course, so I felt confident that they wanted to learn because they're teaching Spanish. So they want to keep face because they're teaching Spanish, and if they don't know something that we could learn in syntax, that's detrimental for them. Now, I'm teaching now Spanish phonetics and phonology at the 300 level, and I'm not ungrading because I think that I need to stop and think really well, and I think I need more experience with ungrading before I can trust myself that the students are gonna end up meeting those objectives that the class has. So I think that I would start ungrading some portions of it. But at the end of the day, with some language courses or with a technical course like phonetics and phonology, it's gonna be right or wrong. And originally, the labor-based contracts are the philosophy behind is that there's no right or wrong because people come with different dialects, etc. So it's more about the writing process and not about technical knowledge. So I do doubt that ungrading at the 100 or 200 level is going to be as easy or as rewarding as a graduate course, because I do have my concerns that some students would try to take advantage of the system. So I think that we always need to have those time logs and those reflection logs, so we can also go to them and say, hey, do you really put enough effort here? You're still going to get the full credit, but I know you're not putting enough effort here. So maybe that will help for students. Like somebody said about cheating. If they're cheating, you can just have a conversation with them and see where it goes from there. People are going to cheat no matter what.
Thank you very much, Maite. I see someone put in the chat that they'd like the same question directed to you, Morgane. Would you like to take it?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I agree with Maite. I'd be afraid. I purposely did not test it in the first semester of French class. The motivation aspect is not that concerning for me in so much as if they only want a D, they only want a D, you know, it's a requirement, that's fine. I understand that logic. I was the same way in college. That being said, I would be afraid of the feedback and how feedback would be given in an ungrading model, in a contract-based model or labor-based Maite. In so much as it's a lot of work. Just with nine students, I think it took more work to give meaningful feedback. But also peer review would not be necessarily possible, at least not immediately. We would have to give them models, like Meg Malone kind of explained, at least give some models before we can implement meaningful peer reviews with like 1-level rubrics, right? So I would like to try it. I will try it. I'm not sure exactly when. I think I still want to do some tweaking, but certainly it's worth a shot to do with, well, yeah, the first or second semester language classes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else for questions? You can just speak up or So I had another question. I'll jump in, which is that, you know, as I think all three of you kind of had a kind of like a baseline or a grade at which as your students grade themselves, but what I think Maria had it as like meets requirements at 80% for at least right or wrong ones, and then Morgane has a desired grade that students note, and Maite had initial goal of B. What happens or how do you encourage your students to kind of go beyond what they set as that goal? I kind of remember as a child, my father always told me, you know, aim for a C and you may get an F. So at least aim for an A and you're guaranteed a C. So just point of view that with these initial goals that are set by students. Maria?
Sure. So a slight difference then I think with the specs grading is that there's not on assignments that have plausible or correct answers, if they get 80%, they earn credit for that. But then the end grade that they get is built on how many and what types of assignments they've earned credit on. So it's not a matter of it's not a matter of earning a grade on any one assignment, but I will compare it to tennis in the sense that they just need to get the ball over the net. They can hit an ace or it can skim that net, but if it gets over, they have credit, but it's how many times they get it over and what types of, you know, that ends up being their final grade.
Thank you. We have like 2 more minutes if anybody else would like to ask a question or. Well, this has been quite a day, hearing all kinds of different ideas, and especially I've fully been appreciative of hearing also everyone looking at all the pros and also being at times conscious and formal about also some of the cons and maybe drawbacks and things, warning us about. So thank you so much. This was great. Thank you all of you for being here. And we go on to the next panel and group. And so I look forward to seeing you in one of those. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Have a great day.